This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 45. Behold my lady's carriage stop the way, with powdered lackey and with charming bay. She sweeps the matting, treads the crimson stair, her arduous function solely to be there. Like Sirius rising o'er the silent sea, she hides her heart in lustre loftily. So the Grandcourts were in Grosvenor Square in time to receive a card for the musical party at Lady Mallinger's, there being reasons of business which made Sir Hugo know beforehand that his ill-beloved nephew was coming up. It was only a third evening after their arrival, and Gwendolen made rather an absent-minded acquaintance with her new ceilings and furniture, preoccupied with the certainty that she was going to speak to Deronda again, and also to see the Miss Lapidoth who had gone through so much, and was capable of submitting to anything in the form of duty. For Gwendolen had remembered nearly every word that Deronda had said about Mirah, and especially that phrase, which she repeated to herself bitterly, having an ill-defined consciousness that her own submission was something very different. She would have been obliged to allow, if any one had said it to her, that what she submitted to could not take the shape of duty, but was submission to a yoke drawn on her by an action she was ashamed of, and worn with a strength of selfish motives that left no weight for duty to carry. The drawing-rooms in Park Lane, all white, gold, and pale crimson, were agreeably furnished and not crowded with guests before Mr. and Mrs. Grandcourt entered, and more than half an hour of instrumental music was being followed by an interval of movement and chat. Klesmer was there with his wife, and in his generous interest for Mirah he proposed to accompany her singing of Leo's O Patria Mia, which he had before recommended her to choose, as more distinctive of her than better-known music. He was already at the piano, and Mirah was standing there conspicuously, when Gwendolen, magnificent in her pale green velvet and poisoned diamonds, was ushered to a seat of honor well in view of them. With her long sight and self-command, she had the rare power of quickly distinguishing persons and objects on entering a full room, and while turning her glance toward Mirah she did not neglect to exchange a bow with Klesmer as she passed. The smile seemed to each a lightning flash back on that morning when it had been her ambition to stand as the little Jewess was standing, and survey a grand audience from the higher rank of her talent, instead of which she was one of the ordinary crowd in silk and gems, whose utmost performance it must be to admire or find fault. "He thinks I'm on the right road now," said the lurking resentment within her. Gwendolen had not caught sight of Deronda in her passage, and while she was seated acquitting herself in chat with Sir Hugo, she glanced round her with careful ease, bowing a recognition here and there, and fearful lest an anxious-looking exploration in search of Deronda might be observed by her husband, and afterward rebuked as something damnably vulgar. But all traveling, even that of a slow gradual glance round a room, brings a liability to undesired encounters, and amongst the eyes that met Gwendolen's, forcing her into a slight bow, were those of the amateur too fond of Meyerbeer, Mr. Lush, whom Sir Hugo continued to find useful as a half-caste among gentlemen. He was standing near her husband, who, however, turned a shoulder toward him, and was being understood to listen to Lord Pentreath. How was it that at this moment, for the first time, there darted through Gwendolen like a disagreeable sensation the idea that this man knew all about her husband's life? He had been banished from her sight according to her will, and she had been satisfied. He had sunk entirely into the background of her thoughts, screened away from her by the agitating figures that kept up an inward drama in which Lush had no place. Here suddenly he reappeared at her husband's elbow, and there sprang up in her, like an instantaneously fabricated memory in a dream, the sense of his being connected with the secrets that made her wretched. She was conscious of effort in turning her head away from him, trying to continue her wandering survey as if she had seen nothing of more consequence than the picture on the wall, till she discovered Deronda. But he was not looking toward her, and she withdrew her eyes from him without having got any recognition, consoling herself with the assurance that he must have seen her come in. In fact, he was not standing far from the door with Hans Meyrick, whom he had been careful to bring into Lady Mallinger's list. They were both a little more anxious than was comfortable lest Mirah should not be heard to advantage. Deronda even felt himself on the brink of betraying emotion, Mirah's presence now being linked with crowding images of what had gone before and was to come after, all centering in the brother he was soon to reveal to her, and he had escaped as soon as he could from the side of Lady Pentreath, who had said in her violoncello voice, "Well, your Jewish is pretty, there's no denying that. But where's her Jewish impudence? She looks as demure as a nun. I suppose she learned that on the stage." He was beginning to feel on Mirah's behalf something of what he had felt for himself in his seraphic, boyish time, when Sir Hugo asked him if he would like to be a great singer—an indignant dislike to her being remarked on in a free and easy way, as if she were an imported commodity disdainfully paid for by the fashionable public, and he winced the more because Mordecai, he knew, would feel that the name Jewess was taken as a sort of stamp like the lettering of Chinese silk. In this susceptible mood he saw the Grandcourts enter, and was immediately appealed to by Hans about "that Van Dyke duchess of a beauty." Pray excuse Deronda that in this moment he felt a transient renewal of his first repulsion from Gwendolen, as if she in her beauty and her failings were to blame for the undervaluing of Mirah as a woman, a feeling something like class animosity, which affection for what is not fully recognized by others, whether in persons or in poetry, rarely allows us to escape. To Hans admiring Gwendolen with his habitual hyperbole he answered, with a sarcasm that was not quite good-natured, "I thought you could admire no style of woman but your Berenice." "That is the style I worship, not admire," said Hans. "Other styles of women I might make myself wicked for, but for Berenice I could make myself—well, pretty good, which is something much more difficult." "Hush," said Deronda, under the pretext that the singing was going to begin. He was not so delighted with the answer as might have been expected, and was relieved by Hans's movement to a more advanced spot. Deronda had never before heard Mirah sing O Patria Mia. He knew well Leopardi's fine ode to Italy, when Italy sat like a disconsolate mother in chains, hiding her face on her knees and weeping, and the few selected words were filled for him with the grandeur of the whole, which seemed to breathe an inspiration through the music. Mirah singing this made Mordecai more than ever one presence with her. Certain words not included in the song nevertheless rang within Deronda as harmonies from the invisible. Non ti difende nessun dei tuoi, l'armi, quell'armi, io solo combatterò procomberò sol io. Footnote: Do none of thy children defend thee? Arms, bring me arms! Alone I will fight, alone I will fall. They seemed the very voice of that heroic passion which is falsely said to devote itself in vain when it achieves the godlike end of manifesting unselfish love. And that passion was present to Deronda now as the vivid image of a man dying helplessly away from the possibility of battle. Mirah was equal to his wishes. While the general applause was sounding, Klesmer gave a more valued testimony, audible to her only. "Good, good! The crescendo better than before." But her chief anxiety was to know that she had satisfied Mr. Deronda. Any failure on her part this evening would have pained her as an especial injury to him. Of course all her prospects were due to what he had done for her. Still, this occasion of singing in the house that was his home brought a peculiar demand. She looked toward him in the distance, and he saw that she did; but he remained where he was, and watched the streams of emulous admirers closing around her, till presently they parted to make way for Gwendolen, who was taken up to be introduced by Mrs. Klesmer. Easier now about the little Jewess. Daniel relented toward poor Gwendolen in her splendor, and his memory went back, with some penitence for his momentary hardness, over all the signs and confessions that she too needed a rescue, and one much more difficult than that of the wanderer by the river, a rescue for which he felt himself helpless. The silent question, "But is it not cowardly to make that a reason for turning away?" was the form in which he framed his resolve to go near her on the first opportunity, and show his regard for her past confidence, in spite of Sir Hugo's unwelcome hints. Klesmer, having risen to Gwendolen as she approached, and being included by her in the opening conversation with Mirah, continued near them a little while, looking down with a smile, which was rather in his eyes than on his lips, at the piquant contrast of the two charming young creatures seated on the red divan. The solicitude seemed to be all on the side of the splendid one. "You must let me say how much I am obliged to you," said Gwendolen. "I had heard from Mr. Deronda that I should have a great treat in your singing, but I was too ignorant to imagine how great." "You are very good to say so," answered Mirah, her mind chiefly occupied in contemplating Gwendolen. It was like a new kind of stage experience to her to be close to genuine grand ladies with genuine brilliance and complexions, and they impressed her vaguely as coming out of some unknown drama, in which their parts perhaps got more tragic as they went on. "We shall all want to learn of you, I at least," said Gwendolen. "I sing very badly, as Herr Klesmer will tell you." Here she glanced upward to that higher power rather archly, and continued, "But I have been rebuked for not liking to middling, since I can be nothing more. I think that is a different doctrine from yours?" She was still looking at Klesmer, who said quickly, "Not if it means that it would be worth while for you to study further, and for Miss Lapidoth to have the pleasure of helping you." With that he moved away, and Mirah, taking everything with naive seriousness, said, "If you think I could teach you, I shall be very glad. I am anxious to teach, but I have only just begun. If I do it well, it must be by remembering how my master taught me." Gwendolen was in reality too uncertain about herself to be prepared for this simple promptitude of Mirah's, and in her wish to change the subject, said, with some lapse from the good taste of her first address, "You have not been long in London, I think? But you were perhaps introduced to Mr. Deronda abroad?" "No," said Mirah. "I never saw him before I came to England in the summer." "But he has seen you often and heard you sing a great deal, has he not?" said Gwendolen, led on partly by the wish to hear anything about Deronda, and partly by the awkwardness which besets the readiest person in carrying on a dialogue when empty of matter. "He spoke to you of me with the highest praise. He seemed to know you quite well." "Oh, I was poor and needed help," said Mirah, in a new tone of feeling, "and Mr. Deronda has given me the best friends in the world. That is the only way he came to know anything about me, because he was sorry for me. I had no friends when I came. I was in distress. I owe everything to him." Poor Gwendolen, who had wanted to be a struggling artist herself, could nevertheless not escape the impression that a mode of inquiry which would have been rather rude toward herself was an amiable condescension to this Jewess who was ready to give her lessons. The only effect on Mirah, as always on any mention of Deronda, was to stir reverential gratitude, and anxiety that she should be understood to have the deepest obligation to him. But both he and Hans, who were noticing the pair from a distance, would have felt rather indignant if they had known that the conversation had led up to Mirah's representation of herself in this light of neediness. In the movement that prompted her, however, there was an exquisite delicacy which perhaps she could not have stated explicitly, the feeling that she ought not to allow any one to assume in Deronda a relation of more equality or less generous interest toward her than actually existed. Her answer was delightful to Gwendolen. She thought of nothing but the ready compassion which in another form she had trusted in and found herself; and on the signals that Klesmer was about to play, she moved away in much content, entirely without presentiment that this Jewish protégé would ever make a more important difference in her life than the possible improvement of her singing, if the leisure and spirits of a Mrs. Grandcourt would allow of other lessons than such as the world was giving her at rather a high charge. With her wonted alternation from resolute care of appearances to some rash indulgence of an impulse, she chose, under the pretext of getting farther from the instrument, not to go again to her former seat, but placed herself on a settee where she could only have one neighbor. She was nearer to Deronda than before. Was it surprising that he came up in time to shake hands before the music began? Then, that after he had stood a little while by the elbow of the settee at the empty end, the torrent-like confluences of bass and treble seemed, like a convulsion of nature, to cast the conduct of petty mortals into insignificance, and to warrant his sitting down. But when at the end of Klesmer's playing there came the outburst of talk under which Gwendolen had hoped to speak as she would to Deronda, she observed that Mr. Lush was within hearing, leaning against the wall close by them. She could not help her flush of anger, but she tried to have only an air of polite indifference in saying, "Miss Lapidoth is everything you described her to be." "You have been very quick in discovering that," said Deronda, ironically. "I have not found out all the excellencies you spoke of. I don't mean that," said Gwendolen. "But I think her singing is charming, and herself too. Her face is lovely, not in the least common, and she is such a complete little person. I should think she will be a great success." This speech was grating on Deronda, and he would not answer it, but looked gravely before him. She knew that he was displeased with her, and she was getting so impatient under the neighborhood of Mr. Lush, which prevented her from saying any word she wanted to say, that she meditated some desperate step to get rid of it, and remained silent too. That constraint seemed to last a long while, neither Gwendolen nor Deronda looking at the other, till Lush slowly relieved the wall of his weight, and joined some one at a distance. Gwendolen immediately said, "You despise me for talking artificially." "No," said Deronda, looking at her coolly. "I think that is quite excusable sometimes. But I did not think what you were last saying was altogether artificial." "There was something in it that displeased you," said Gwendolen. "What was it?" "It is impossible to explain such things," said Deronda. "One can never communicate niceties of feeling about words and manner." "You think I am shut out from understanding them," said Gwendolen, with a slight tremor in her voice, which she was trying to conquer. "Have I shown myself so very dense to everything you have said?" There was an indescribable look of suppressed tears in her eyes, which were turned on him. "Not at all," said Deronda, with some softening of voice. "But experience differs for different people. We don't all wince at the same things. I have had plenty of proof that you are not dense." He smiled at her. "But one may feel things, and are not able to do anything better for all that," said Gwendolen, not smiling in return. The distance to which Deronda's words seemed to throw her, chilling her too much. "I begin to think we can only get better by having people about us who raise good feelings. You must not be surprised at anything in me. I think it is too late for me to alter. I don't know how to set about being wise, as you told me to be." "I seldom find I do any good by my preaching. I might as well have kept from meddling," said Deronda, thinking rather sadly that his interference about that unfortunate necklace might end in nothing but an added pain to him in seeing her after all hardened to another sort of gambling than roulette. "Don't say that," said Gwendolen, hurriedly, feeling that this might be her only chance of getting the words uttered, and dreading the increase of her own agitation. "If you despair of me, I shall despair. Your saying that I should not go on being selfish and ignorant has been some strength to me. If you say you wish you had not meddled, that means you despair of me and forsake me, and then you will decide for me that I shall not be good. It is you who will decide, because you might have made me different by keeping as near to me as you could, and believing in me." She had not been looking at him as she spoke, but at the handle of the fan which she held closed. With the last words she rose and left him, returning to her former place, which had been left vacant, while every one was settling into quietude in expectation of Mirah's voice, which presently, with that wonderful searching quality of subdued song in which the melody seems simply an effect of the motion, gave forth, "Per pietà non dirmi addio." In Deronda's ear the strain was for the moment a continuance of Gwendolen's pleading, a painful urging of something vague and difficult, irreconcilable with pressing conditions, and yet cruel to resist. However strange the mixture in her of a resolute pride and a precocious air of knowing the world, with a precipitate, guileless indiscretion, he was quite sure now that the mixture existed. Sir Hugo's hints had made him alive to dangers that his own disposition might have neglected, but that Gwendolen's reliance on him was unvisited by any dream of his being a man who could misinterpret her was as manifest as morning, and made an appeal which wrestled with his sense of present dangers and with his foreboding of a growing incompatible claim on him in her mind. There was a foreshadowing of some painful collision. On the one side, the grasp of Mordecai's dying hand on him, with all the ideals and prospects it aroused; on the other, the fair creature in silk and gems, with her hidden wound and her self‐dread, making a trustful effort to lean and find herself sustained. It was as if he had a vision of himself besought with outstretched arms and cries, while he was caught by the waves and compelled to mount the vessel bound for a far‐off coast. That was the strain of excited feeling in him that went along with the notes of Mirah's song. But when it ceased, he moved from his seat with the reflection that he had been falling into an exaggeration of his own importance, and a ridiculous readiness to accept Gwendolen's view of himself, as if he could really have any decisive power over her. "What an enviable fellow you are," said Hans to him, "sitting on a sofa with that young duchess, and having an interesting quarrel with her." "Quarrel with her?" repeated Deronda, rather uncomfortably. "Oh, about theology, of course. Nothing personal. But she told you what you ought to think, and then left you with a grand air, which was admirable. Is she an antinomian? If so, tell her I am an antinomian painter, and introduce me. I should like to paint her and her husband. He has the sort of handsome physique that the Duke ought to have in Lucrezia Borgia, if it could go with a fine baritone, which it can't." Deronda devoutly hoped that Hans's account of the impression his dialogue with Gwendolen had made on a distant beholder was no more than a bit of fantastic representation, such as was common with him. And Gwendolen was not without her afterthoughts that her husband's eyes might have been on her, extracting something to reprove, some offense against her dignity as his wife; her consciousness telling her that she had not kept up the perfect air of equability in public which was her own ideal. But Grandcourt made no observation on her behavior. All he said as they were driving home was, "Lush will dine with us among the other people to‐morrow. You will treat him civilly." Gwendolen's heart began to beat violently. The words that she wanted to utter, as one wants to return a blow, were, "You are breaking your promise to me, the first promise you made me." But she dared not utter them. She was as frightened at a quarrel as if she had foreseen that it would end with throttling fingers on her neck. After a pause, she said in the tone rather of defeat than resentment, "I thought you did not intend him to frequent the house again." "I want him just now. He is useful to me, and he must be treated civilly." Silence. There may come a moment when even an excellent husband who has dropped smoking under more or less of a pledge during courtship, for the first time will introduce his cigar smoke between himself and his wife, with the tacit understanding that she will have to put up with it. Mr. Lush was, so to speak, a very large cigar. If these are the sort of lovers' vows at which Jove laughs, he must have a merry time of it. End of chapter 45. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 46. If any one should importune me to give a reason why I loved him, I feel it could no otherwise be expressed than by making answer, because it was he, because it was I. There is beyond what I am able to say, I know not what inexplicable power that brought on this union. Montaigne, on Friendship. The time had come to prepare Mordecai for the revelation of the restored sister, and for the change of abode which was desirable before Mirah's meeting with her brother. Mrs. Meyrick, to whom Deronda had confided everything except Mordecai's peculiar relation to himself, had been active in helping him to find a suitable lodging in Brompton, not many minutes' walk from her own house, so that the brother and sister would be within reach of her motherly care. Her happy mixture of Scottish fervor and Gallic liveliness had enabled her to keep the secret close from the girls as well as from Hans, any betrayal to them being likely to reach Mirah in some way that would raise an agitating suspicion and spoil the important opening of that work which was to secure her independence, as we rather arbitrarily call one of the more arduous and dignified forms of our dependence. And both Mrs. Meyrick and Deronda had more reasons than they could have expressed for desiring that Mirah should be able to maintain herself. Perhaps the little mother was rather helped in her secrecy by some dubiousness in her sentiment about the remarkable brother described to her; and certainly if she felt any joy and anticipatory admiration, it was due to her faith in Deronda's judgment. The consumption was a sorrowful fact that appealed to her tenderness. But how was she to be very glad of an enthusiasm which, to tell the truth, she could only contemplate as Jewish pertinacity, and as rather an undesirable introduction among them all of a man whose conversation would not be more modern and encouraging than that of Scott's Covenanters? Her mind was anything but prosaic, and had her soberer share of Mab's delight in the romance of Mirah's story, and of her abode with them. But the romantic or unusual in real life requires some adaptation. We sit up at night to read about Sakya Mauni, St. Francis, or Oliver Cromwell, but whether we should be glad for any one at all like them to call on us the next morning, still more to reveal himself as a new relation, is quite another affair. Besides, Mrs. Meyrick had hoped, as her children did, that the intensity of Mirah's feeling about Judaism would slowly subside, and be merged in the gradually deepening current of loving interchange with her new friends. In fact, her secret favorite continuation of the romance had been no discovery of Jewish relations, but something much more favorable to the hopes she discerned in Hans. And now there was a brother who would dip Mirah's mind over again in the deepest dye of Jewish sentiment. She could not help saying to Deronda, "I am as glad as you are that the pawnbroker is not her brother. There are Ezras and Ezras in the world, and really it is a comfort to think that all Jews are not like those shopkeepers who will not let you get out of their shops. And besides, what he said to you about his mother and sister makes me bless him. I am sure he's good, but I never did like anything fanatical. I suppose I heard a little too much preaching in my youth and lost my palate for it." "I don't think you will find that Mordecai obtrudes any preaching," said Deronda. "He is not what I should call fanatical. I call a man fanatical when his enthusiasm is narrow and hoodwinked, so that he has no sense of proportions, and becomes unjust and unsympathetic to men who are out of his own track. Mordecai is an enthusiast. I should like to keep that word for the highest order of minds, those who care supremely for grand and general benefits to mankind. He is not a strictly orthodox Jew, and is full of allowances for others. His conformity in many things is an allowance for the condition of other Jews. The people he lives with are as fond of him as possible, and they can't in the least understand his ideas. Oh well, I can live up to the level of the pawnbroker's mother, and like him for what I see to be good in him, and for what I don't see the merits of, I will take your word. According to your definition, I suppose one might be fanatical in worshipping common sense, for my poor husband used to say the world would be a poor place if there were nothing but common sense in it. However, Mirah's brother will have good bedding, that I have taken care of, and I shall have this extra window pasted up with paper to prevent draughts." The conversation was taking place in the destined lodging. "It is a comfort to think that the people of the house are no strangers to me, no hypocritical harpies, and when the children know, we shall be able to make the rooms much prettier." The next stage of the affair is to tell all to Mordecai and get him to move, which may be a more difficult business, said Deronda. "And will you tell Mirah before I say anything to the children?" said Mrs. Meyrick. But Deronda hesitated, and she went on in a tone of persuasive deliberation. "No, I think not. Let me tell Hans and the girls the evening before, and they will be away the next morning?" "Yes, that will be the best. But do justice to my account of Mordecai, or Ezra, as I suppose Mirah will wish to call him. Don't assist their imagination by referring to Habakkuk Mucklewrath," said Deronda, smiling, Mrs. Meyrick herself having used the comparison of the Covenanters. Trust me," said the little mother. "I shall have to persuade them so hard to be glad that I shall convert myself. When I am frightened, I find it a good thing to have somebody to be angry with for not being brave. It warms the blood." Deronda might have been more argumentative or persuasive about the view to be taken of Mirah's brother, if he had been less anxiously preoccupied with the more important task immediately before him, which he desired to acquit himself of without wounding the Cohens. Mordecai, by a memorable answer, had made it evident that he would be keenly alive to any inadvertence in relation to their feelings. In the interval he had been meeting Mordecai at the Hand and Banner, but now, after due reflection, he wrote to him saying that he had particular reasons for wishing to see him in his own home the next evening, and would beg to sit with him in his workroom for an hour, if the Cohens would not regard it as an intrusion. He would call with the understanding that if there were any objection Mordecai would accompany him elsewhere. Deronda hoped in this way to create a little expectation that would have a preparatory effect. He was received with the usual friendliness, some additional costume in the women and children, and in all the elders a slight air of wondering which even in Cohen was not allowed to pass the bounds of silence, the guest's transactions with Mordecai being a sort of mystery which he was rather proud to think lay outside the sphere of light which enclosed his own understanding. But when Deronda said, "I suppose Mordecai is at home and expecting me," Jacob, who had profited by the family remarks, went up to his knees and said, "What do you want to talk to Mordecai about?" "Something that is very interesting to him," said Deronda, pinching the lad's ear, "but that you can't understand." "Can you say this?" said Jacob, immediately giving forth a string of his rote-learned Hebrew verses with a wonderful mixture of the throaty and the nasal, and nodding his small head at his hearer, with a sense of giving formidable evidence which might rather alter their mutual position. "No, really," said Deronda, keeping grave. "I can't say anything like it." "I thought not," said Jacob, performing a dance of triumph with his small scarlet legs, while he took various objects out of the deep pockets of his knickerbockers and returned them thither, as a slight hint of his resources; after which, running to the door of the workroom, he opened it wide, set his back against it, and said, "Mordecai, here's the young swell," a copying of his father's phrase, which seemed to him well fitted to cap the recitation of Hebrew. He was called back with hushes by mother and grandmother, and Deronda, entering and closing the door behind him, saw that a bit of carpet had been laid down, a chair placed, and the fire and lights attended to, in sign of the Cohen's respect. As Mordecai rose to greet him, Deronda was struck with the air of solemn expectation in his face, such as would have seemed perfectly natural if his letter had declared that some revelation was to be made about the lost sister. Neither of them spoke, till Deronda, with his usual tenderness of manner, had drawn the vacant chair from the opposite side of the hearth and had seated himself next to Mordecai, who then said, in a tone of fervid certainty, "You are coming to tell me something that my soul longs for." "It is true I have something very weighty to tell you, something I trust that you will rejoice in," said Deronda, on his guard against the probability that Mordecai had been preparing himself for something quite different from the fact. "It is all revealed, it is made clear to you," said Mordecai, more eagerly, leaning forward with clasped hands. "You are even as my brother that sucked the breasts of my mother. The heritage is yours. There is no doubt to divide us." "I have learned nothing new about myself," said Deronda. The disappointment was inevitable. It was better not to let the feeling be strained longer in a mistaken hope. Mordecai sank back in his chair, unable for the moment to care what was really coming. The whole day his mind had been in a state of tension toward one fulfillment. The reaction was sickening, and he closed his eyes. "Except," Deronda went on gently after a pause, "except that I had really some time ago come into another sort of hidden connection with you, besides what you have spoken of as existing in your own feeling." The eyes were not opened, but there was a fluttering in the lids. "I had made the acquaintance of one in whom you are interested, one who is closely related to your departed mother." Deronda went on, wishing to make the disclosure gradual, but noticing a shrinking movement in Mordecai, he added, "whom she and you held dear above all others." Mordecai, with a sudden start, laid a spasmodic grasp on Deronda's wrist. There was a great terror in him, and Deronda divined it. A tremor was perceptible in his clear tones as he said, "What was prayed for has come to pass. Mirah has been delivered from evil." Mordecai's grasp relaxed a little, but he was panting with a tearless sob. Deronda went on, "Your sister is worthy of the mother you honored." He waited there, and Mordecai, throwing himself backward in his chair, again closed his eyes, uttering himself almost inaudibly for some minutes in Hebrew, and then subsiding into a happy-looking silence. Deronda watched the expression in his uplifted face, could have imagined that he was speaking with some beloved object. There was a new suffused sweetness, something like that on the faces of the beautiful dead. For the first time Deronda thought he discerned a family resemblance to Mirah. Presently, when Mordecai was ready to listen, the rest was told. But in accounting for Mirah's flight, he made the statement about the father's conduct as vague as he could, and threw the emphasis on her yearning to come to England as the place where she might find her mother. Also he kept back the fact of Mirah's intention to drown herself, and his own part in rescuing her, merely describing the home she had found with friends of his, whose interest in her and efforts for her he had shared. What he dwelt on finally was Mirah's feeling about her mother and brother, and in relation to this he tried to give every detail. "I was in search of them," said Deronda, smiling, "that I turned into this house. The name Ezra Cohen was just then the most interesting name in the world to me. I confess I had fear for a long while. Perhaps you will forgive me now for having asked you that question about the elder Mrs. Cohen's daughter. I cared very much what I should find Mirah's friends to be, but I had found a brother worthy of her when I knew that her Ezra was disguised under the name of Mordecai. Mordecai is really my name, Ezra Mordecai Cohen." "Is there any kinship between this family and yours?" said Deronda. "Only the kinship of Israel. My soul clings to these people, who have sheltered me and given me succor out of the affection that abides in Jewish hearts, as sweet odor in things long crushed and hidden from the outer air. It is good for me to hear with their ignorance and be bound to them in gratitude, that I may keep in mind the spiritual poverty of the Jewish million, and not put impatient knowledge in the stead of loving wisdom." "But you don't feel bound to continue with them now there is a closer tie to draw you?" said Deronda, not without fear that he might find an obstacle to overcome. "It seems to me right now, is it not, that you should live with your sister, and I have prepared a home to take you to in the neighborhood of her friends, that she may join you there. Pray grant me this wish. It will enable me to be with you often in the hours when Mirah is obliged to leave you. That is my selfish reason. But the chief reason is, that Mirah will desire to watch over you, and that you ought to give her the guardianship of a brother's presence. You shall have books about you. I shall want to learn of you, and to take you out to see the river and trees, and you will have the rest and comfort that you will be more and more in need of—nay, that I need for you. This is the claim I make on you now that we have found each other." Deronda spoke in a tone of earnest, affectionate pleading, such as he might have used to a venerated elder brother. Mordecai's eyes were fixed on him with a listening contemplation, and he was silent for a little while after Deronda had ceased to speak. Then he said, with an almost reproachful emphasis, "And you would have me hold it doubtful whether you were born a Jew? Have we not from the first touched each other with invisible fibers? Have we not quivered together like the leaves from a common stem with stirring from a common root? I know what I am outwardly. I am one among the crowd of poor. I am stricken. I am dying. But our souls know each other. They gazed in silence as those who have long been parted and meet again. But when they found voice, they were assured, and all their speech is understanding. The life of Israel is in your veins." Deronda sat perfectly still, but felt his face tingling. It was impossible either to deny or assent. He waited, hoping that Mordecai would presently give him a more direct answer, and after a pause of meditation he did say firmly, "What you wish of me I will do. And our mother, may the blessing of the Eternal be with her in our souls, would have wished it too. I will accept what your loving kindness has prepared, and Mirah's home shall be mine." He paused a moment, and then added in a more melancholy tone, "But I shall grieve to part from these parents and the little ones. You must tell them, for my heart would fail me." "I felt that you would want me to tell them. Shall we go now at once?" said Deronda, much relieved by this unwavering compliance. "Yes, let us not defer it. It must be done," said Mordecai, rising with the air of a man who has to perform a painful duty. Then came as an afterthought, "But do not dwell on my sister more than is needful." When they entered the parlor, and he said to the alert Jacob, "Ask your father to come, and tell Sarah to mind the shop. My friend has something to say," he continued, turning to the elder Mrs. Cohen. It seemed part of Mordecai's eccentricity that he should call this gentleman his friend, and the two women tried to show their better manners by warm politeness in begging Deronda to seat himself in the best place. When Cohen entered with a pen behind his ear, he rubbed his hands and said with loud satisfaction, "Well, sir, I'm glad you're doing us the honor to join our family party again. We are pretty comfortable, I think." He looked round with shiny gladness, and when all were seated on the hearth, the scene was worth peeping in upon. In one side, baby under her scarlet quilt in the corner being rocked by the young mother, and Adelaide Rebekah seated on the grandmother's knee; on the other, Jacob between his father's legs, while the two markedly different figures of Deronda and Mordecai were in the middle, Mordecai a little backward in the shade, anxious to conceal his agitated susceptibility to what was going on around him. The chief light came from the fire, which brought out the rich color on a depth of shadow, and seemed to turn into speech the dark gems of eyes that looked at each other kindly. "I have just been telling Mordecai of an event that makes a great change in his life," Deronda began, "but I hope you will agree with me that it is a joyful one. Since he thinks of you as his best friends, he wishes me to tell you for him at once." "Relations with money, sir!" burst in Cohen, feeling a power of divination which it was a pity to nullify by waiting for the fact. "No, not exactly," said Deronda, smiling. "But a very precious relation wishes to be united to him—a very good and lovely young sister, who will care for his comfort in every way." "Married, sir?" "No, not married." "But with a maintenance?" "With talents which will secure her a maintenance. A home is already provided for Mordecai." There was silence for a moment or two before the grandmother said in a wailing tone, "Well, well, and so you're going away from us, Mordecai." "And where there's no children as there is here," said the mother, catching the wail. "No Jacob, and no Adelaide, and no Eugenie," wailed the grandmother again. "Aye, aye, Jacob's learning 'll all wear out of him. He must go to school. It'll be hard times for Jacob," said Cohen, in a tone of decision. In the wide open ears of Jacob his father's words sounded like a doom, giving an awful finish to the dirge-like effect of the whole announcement. His face had been gathering a wondering, incredulous sorrow at the notion of Mordecai's going away. He was unable to imagine the change as anything lasting. But at the mention of hard times for Jacob, there was no further suspense of feeling, and he broke forth in loud lamentation. Adelaide Rebekah always cried when her brother cried, and now began to howl with astonishing suddenness, whereupon baby, awaking, contributed angry screams, and required to be taken out of the cradle. A great deal of hushing was necessary, and Mordecai, feeling the cries pierce him, put out his arms to Jacob, who in the midst of his tears and sobs was turning his head right and left for general observation. His father, who had been saying, "Never mind, old man, you shall go to the riders," now released him, and he went to Mordecai, who clasped him and laid his cheek on the little black head without speaking. But Cohen, sensible that the master of the family must make some apology for all this weakness, and that the occasion called for a speech, addressed Deronda with some elevation of pitch, squaring his elbows and resting a hand on each knee. "It's not as we're the people to grudge anybody's good luck, sir, or the portion of their cup being made fuller, as I may say. I'm not an envious man, and if anybody offered to set up Mordecai in a shop of my sort 2 doors lower down, I shouldn't make wry faces about it. I'm not one of them that need have a poor opinion of themselves and be frightened at anybody else getting a chance. If I'm offal, let a wise man come and tell me, for I've never heard it yet, and in point of business I'm not a class of goods to be in danger. If anybody takes to rolling me, I can pack myself up like a caterpillar, and find my feet when I'm let alone. And though as I may say you're taking some of our good works from us, which is property bearing interest, I'm not saying but we can afford that, though my mother and my wife had the good will to wish and do for Mordecai to the last. And a Jew must not be like a servant who works for reward, though I see nothing against a reward if I can get it. And as to the extra outlay in schooling, I'm neither poor nor greedy. I wouldn't hang myself for sixpence, nor half a crown neither. But the truth of it is, the women and children are fond of Mordecai. You may partly see how it is, sir, by your own sense. A Jewish man is bound to thank God day by day that he was not made a woman, but a woman has to thank God that he has made her according to his will. And we all know what he has made her. A child-bearing, tender-hearted thing is the woman of our people. Her children are mostly stout, and I think you'll say Addie's heir, and she's not mushy, but her heart is tender. So you must excuse present company, sir, for not being glad all at once. And as to this young lady, for by what you say young lady is the proper term," Cohen here threw some additional emphasis into his look and tone, "we shall all be glad for Mordecai's sake by and by, when we cast up our accounts and see where we are." Before Deronda could summon any answer to this oddly mixed speech, Mordecai exclaimed, "Friends, friends! For food and raiment and shelter I would not have sought better than you have given me. You have sweetened the morsel with love, and what I thought of as a joy that would be left to me even in the last months of my waning strength was to go on teaching the lad. But now I am as one who had clad himself beforehand in his shroud, and used himself to making the grave his bed, when the divine command sounded in his ears, 'Arise and go forth, the night is not yet come.' For no light matter would I have turned away from your kindness to take another's. But it has been taught us, as you know, that the reward of one duty is the power to fulfill another. So said Ben Azai. You have made your duty to one of the poor among your brethren a joy to you and me, and your reward shall be that you will not rest without the joy of like deeds in the time to come. And may not Jacob come and visit me?" Mordecai had turned with this question to Deronda, who said, "Surely that can be managed. It is no further than Brompton." Jacob, who had been gradually calmed by the need to hear what was going forward, began now to see some daylight on the future, the word visit having the lively charm of cakes and general relaxation at his grandfather's, the dealer in knives. He danced away from Mordecai and took up a station of survey in the middle of the hearth with his hands in his knickerbockers. "Well," said the grandmother with a sigh of resignation, "I hope there'll be nothing in the way of your getting kosher meat, Mordecai, for you'll have to trust to those you live with." "That's all right, that's all right, you may be sure, mother," said Cohen, as if anxious to cut off inquiry on matters in which he was uncertain of the guest's position. "So, sir," he added, turning with a look of amused enlightenment to Deronda, "it was better than learning you had to talk to Mordecai about. I wondered to myself at the time. I thought somehow there was a something." "Mordecai will perhaps explain to you how it was that I was seeking him," said Deronda, feeling that he had better go, and rising as he spoke. It was agreed that he should come again, and the final move be made on the next day but one. But when he was going, Mordecai begged to walk with him to the end of the street, and wrapped himself in coat and comforter. It was a March evening, and Deronda did not mean to let him go far, but he understood the wish to be outside the house with him in communicative silence, after the exciting speech that had been filling the last hour. No word was spoken until Deronda had proposed parting, when he said, "Mirah would wish to thank the Cohens for their goodness. You would wish her to do so, to come and see them, would you not?" Mordecai did not answer immediately, but at length said, "I cannot tell. I fear not. There is a family sorrow, and the sight of my sister might be to them as the fresh bleeding of wounds. There is a daughter and sister who will never be restored as Mirah is. But who knows the pathways? We are all of us denying or fulfilling prayers, and men in their careless deeds walk amidst invisible outstretched arms and pleadings made in vain. In my ears I have the prayers of generations past and to come. My life is as nothing to me but the beginning of fulfillment, and yet I am only another prayer, which you will fulfill." Deronda pressed his hand, and they parted. End of chapter 46. This recording is in the public domain. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 47. And you must love him ere to you he will seem worthy of your love. Wordsworth. One might be tempted to envy Deronda providing new clothes for Mordecai, and pleasing himself as if he were sketching a picture in imagining the effect of the fine gray flannel shirts and a dressing gown very much like a Franciscan's brown frock, with Mordecai's head and neck above them. Half his pleasure was the sense of seeing Mirah's brother through her eyes, and securing her fervid joy from any perturbing impression. And yet, after he had made all things ready, he was visited with doubt whether he were not mistaking her, and putting the lower effect for the higher. Was she not just as capable as he himself had been of feeling the impressive distinction in her brother, all the more for that aspect of poverty which was among the memorials of his past? But there were the Meyricks to be propitiated toward this too Judaic brother. And Deronda detected himself piqued into getting out of sight everything that might feed the ready repugnance in minds unblessed with that precious seeing, that bathing of all objects in a solemnity as of sunset glow, which is begotten of a loving reverential emotion. And his inclination would have been the more confirmed if he had heard the dialogue round Mrs. Meyrick's fire late in the evening, after Mirah had gone to her room. Hans, settled now in his Chelsea rooms, had stayed late, and Mrs. Meyrick, poking the fire into a blaze, said, "Now, Kate, put out your candle, and I'll come round the fire cosily. Hans, dear, do leave off laughing at those poems for the 99th time, and come too. I have something wonderful to tell." "As if I didn't know that, ma. I've seen it in the corner of your eye ever so long, and in your pretense of errands," said Kate, while the girls came up to put their feet on the fender, and Hans, pushing his chair near them, sat astride it, resting his fists and chin on the back. "Well, then, if you are so wise, perhaps you know that Mirah's brother is found," said Mrs. Meyrick, in her clearest accents. "Oh, confound it!" said Hans in the same moment. "Hans, that is wicked," said Mab. "Suppose we had lost you?" "I cannot help being rather sorry," said Kate. "And her mother, where is she?" "Her mother is dead." "I hope the brother is not a bad man," said Amy. "Nor a fellow all smiles and jewelry, a Crystal Palace Assyrian with a hat on," said Hans in the worst humor. "Were there ever such unfeeling children?" said Mrs. Meyrick, a little strengthened by the need for opposition. "You don't think the least bit of Mirah's joy in the matter." "You know, ma, Mirah hardly remembers her brother," said Kate. "People who are lost for 12 years should never come back again," said Hans. "They're always in the way." "Hans!" said Mrs. Meyrick reproachfully. "If you had lost me for 20 years, I should have thought—" "I said 12 years," Hans broke in. "Anywhere about 12 years is the time at which lost relations should keep out of the way." "Well, but it's nice finding people. There is something to tell," said Mab, clasping her knees. "Did Prince Camaralzaman find him?" Then Mrs. Meyrick, in her neat narrative way, told all she knew without interruption. "Mr. Deronda has the highest admiration for him," she ended, "seems quite to look up to him, and he says Mirah is just the sister to understand this brother." "Deronda is getting perfectly preposterous about those Jews," said Hans with disgust, rising and setting his chair away with a bang. "He wants to do everything he can to encourage Mirah in her prejudices." "Oh, for shame, Hans, to speak in that way of Mr. Deronda," said Mab, and Mrs. Meyrick's face showed something like an undercurrent of expression not allowed to get to the surface. "And now we shall never be all together," Hans went on, walking about with his hands thrust into the pockets of his brown velveteen coat. "But we must have this prophet Elijah to tea with us, and Mirah will think of nothing but sitting on the ruins of Jerusalem. She will be spoiled as an artist. Mind that, she will get as narrow as a nun. Everything will be spoiled—our home and everything. I shall take to drinking." "Oh, really, Hans," said Kate impatiently, "I do think men are the most contemptible animals in all creation. Every one of them must have everything to his mind, else he is unbearable." "Oh, oh, it is very dreadful!" cried Mab. "I feel as if ancient Nineveh were come again." "I should like to know what is the good of having gone to the university and knowing everything, if you are so childish, Hans," said Amy. "You ought to put up with a man that Providence sends you to be kind to. We shall have to put up with him." "I hope you will all of you like the new Lamentations of Jeremiah, to be continued in our next, that's all," said Hans, seizing his wide awake. "It's no use being one thing more than another if one has to endure the company of those men with a fixed idea, staring blankly at you, and requiring all your remarks to be small footnotes to their text. If you're to be under a petrifying wall, you'd better be an old boot. I don't feel myself an old boot." Then abruptly, "Good night, little mother," bending to kiss her brow in a hasty, desperate manner, and condescendingly on his way to the door, "Good night, girls." "Suppose Mirah knew how you were behaving," said Kate. But her answer was a slam of the door. "I should like to see Mirah when Mr. Deronda tells her," she went on to her mother. "I know she will look so beautiful." But Deronda, on second thoughts, had written a letter, which Mrs. Meyrick received the next morning, begging her to make the revelation instead of waiting for him, not giving the real reason, that he shrank from going again through a narrative in which he seemed to be making himself important and giving himself a character of general beneficence, but saying that he wished to remain with Mordecai while Mrs. Meyrick would bring Mirah on what was to be understood as a visit, so that there might be a little interval before that change of abode which he expected that Mirah herself would propose. Deronda secretly felt some wondering anxiety how far Mordecai, after years of solitary preoccupation with ideas, likely to have become the more exclusive from continual diminution of bodily strength, would allow him to feel a tender interest in his sister over and above the rendering of pious duties. His feeling for the Cohens, and especially for little Jacob, showed a persistent activity of affection, but these objects had entered into his daily life for years, and Deronda felt it noticeable that Mordecai asked no new questions about Mirah, maintaining indeed an unusual silence on all subjects, and appearing simply to submit to the changes that were coming over his personal life. He donned the new clothes obediently, but said afterward to Deronda with a faint smile, "I must keep my old garments by me for a remembrance." And when they were seated, awaiting Mirah, he uttered no word, keeping his eyelids closed, but yet showing restless feeling in his face and hands. In fact, Mordecai was undergoing that peculiar nervous perturbation only known to those whose minds, long and habitually moving with strong impetus in one current, are suddenly compelled into a new or reopened channel. Susceptible people, whose strength has been long absorbed by dormant bias, dread an interview that imperiously revives the past, as they would dread a threatening illness. Joy may there be, but joy too is terrible. Deronda felt the infection of excitement, and when he heard the ring at the door he went out, not knowing exactly why, that he might see and greet Mirah beforehand. He was startled to find that she had on the hat and cloak in which he had first seen her, the memorable cloak that had once been wetted for a winding-sheet. She had come downstairs equipped in this way, and when Mrs. Meyrick said in a tone of question, "You like to go in that dress, dear?" she answered, "My brother is poor, and I want to look as much like him as I can, else he may feel distant from me," imagining that she should meet him in the workman's dress. Deronda could not make any remark, but felt secretly rather ashamed of his own fastidious arrangements. They shook hands silently, for Mirah looked pale and awed. When Deronda opened the door for her, Mordecai had risen, and had his eyes turned toward it with an eager gaze. Mirah took only 2 or 3 steps, then stood still. They looked at each other, motionless. It was less their own presence that they felt than another's. They were meeting first in memories, compared with which touch was no union. Mirah was the first to break the silence, standing where she was. "Ezra," she said, in exactly the same tone as when she was telling of her mother's call to him. Mordecai, with a sudden movement, advanced and laid his hand on her shoulders. He was the head taller, and looked down at her tenderly while he said, "That was our mother's voice. You remember her calling me?" "Yes, and how you answered her, 'Mother!' and I knew you loved her." Mirah threw her arms round her brother's neck, clasped her little hands behind it, and drew down his face, kissing it with childlike lavishness. Her hat fell backward on the ground and disclosed all her curls. "Ah, the dear head, the dear head!" said Mordecai, in a low, loving tone, laying his thin hand gently on the curls. "You are very ill, Ezra," said Mirah, sadly looking at him with more observation. "Yes, dear child, I shall not be long with you in the body," was the quiet answer. "Oh, I will love you, and we will talk to each other," said Mirah, with a sweet outpouring of her words, as spontaneous as bird notes. "I will tell you everything, and you will teach me. You will teach me to be a good Jewess, what she would have liked me to be. I shall always be with you when I am not working, for I work now. I shall get money to keep us. Oh, I have had such good friends!" Mirah until now had quite forgotten that any one was by, but here she turned with the prettiest attitude, keeping one hand on her brother's arm while she looked at Mrs. Meyrick and Deronda. The little mother's happy emotion in witnessing this meeting of brother and sister had already won her to Mordecai, who seemed to her really to have more dignity and refinement than she had felt obliged to believe in from Deronda's account. "See this dear lady," said Mirah. "I was a stranger, a poor wanderer, and she believed in me, and has treated me as a daughter. Please give my brother your hand," she added, beseechingly, taking Mrs. Meyrick's hand and putting it in Mordecai's, then pressing them both with her own and lifting them to her lips. "The eternal goodness has been with you," said Mordecai. "You have helped to fulfill our mother's prayer." "I think we will go now, shall we, and return later?" said Deronda, laying a gentle pressure on Mrs. Meyrick's arm, and she immediately complied. He was afraid of any reference to the facts about himself which he had kept back from Mordecai, and he felt no uneasiness now in the thought of the brother and sister being alone together. Chapter 47. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda, by George Eliot. Chapter 48. 'Tis hard and ill-paid task to order all things beforehand by the rule of our own security, as is well hinted by Machiavelli concerning Caesar Borgia, who, saith he, had thought of all that might occur on his father's death, and had provided against every evil chance save only one. It had never come into his mind that when his father died, his own death would quickly follow. Grandcourt's importance as a subject of this realm was of the grandly passive kind which consists in the inheritance of land. Political and social movements touched him only through the wire of his rental, and his most careful biographer need not have read up on Schleswig-Holstein, the policy of Bismarck, trade unions, household suffrage, or even the last commercial panic. He glanced over the best newspaper columns on these topics, and his views on them can hardly be said to have wanted breadth, since he embraced all Germans, all commercial men, and all voters liable to use the wrong kind of soap, under the general epithet of brutes. But he took no action on these much agitated questions beyond looking from under his eyelids at any man who mentioned them, and retaining a silence which served to shake the opinions of timid thinkers. But Grandcourt, within his own sphere of interest, showed some of the qualities which have entered into triumphal diplomacy of the wildest continental sort. No movement of Gwendolen in relation to Deronda escaped him. He would have denied that he was jealous, because jealousy would have implied some doubt of his own power to hinder what he had determined against. That his wife should have more inclination to another man's society than to his own would not pain him. What he required was that she should be as fully aware as she would have been of a locked handcuff, that her inclination was helpless to decide anything in contradiction with his resolve. However much of vacillating whim there might have been in his entrance on matrimony, there was no vacillating in his interpretation of the bond. He had not repented of his marriage. It had really brought more of aim into his life, new objects to exert his will upon, and he had not repented of his choice. His taste was fastidious, and Gwendolen satisfied it. He would not have liked a wife who had not received some elevation of rank from him, nor one who did not command admiration by her mien and beauty, nor one whose nails were not of the right shape, nor one the lobe of whose ears was at all too large and red, nor one who, even if her nails and ears were right, was at the same time a ninny, unable to make spirited answers. These requirements may not seem too exacting to refined contemporaries whose own ability to fall in love has been held in suspense for lack of indispensable details. But fewer perhaps may follow him in his contentment that his wife should be in a temper which would dispose her to fly out if she dared, and that she should have been urged into marrying him by other feelings than passionate attachment. Still, for those who prefer command to love, one does not see why the habit of mind should change precisely at the point of matrimony. Grandcourt did not feel that he had chosen the wrong wife, and having taken on himself the part of husband, he was not going in any way to be fooled, or allow himself to be seen in a light that could be regarded as pitiable. This was his state of mind, not jealousy. Still, his behavior in some aspects was as like jealousy as yellow is to yellow, which color we know may be the effect of very different causes. He had come up to town earlier than usual because he wished to be on the spot for legal consultation as to the arrangements of his will, the transference of mortgages, and that transaction with his uncle about the succession to Diplow, which the bait of ready money, adroitly dangled without importunity, had finally won him to agree upon. But another acceptable accompaniment of his being in town was the presentation of himself with the beautiful bride whom he had chosen to marry in spite of what other people might have expected of him. It is true that Grandcourt went about with the sense that he did not care a languid curse for any one's admiration. But this state of not caring, just as much as desire, required its related object, namely, a world of admiring or envying spectators. For if you are fond of looking stonily at smiling persons, the persons must be, and they must smile: a rudimentary truth which is surely forgotten by those who complain of mankind as generally contemptible, since any other aspect of the race must disappoint the veracity of their contempt. Grandcourt, in town for the first time with his wife, had his non-caring abstinence from curses enlarged and diversified by splendid receptions, by conspicuous rides and drives, by presentations of himself with her on all distinguished occasions. He wished her to be sought after. He liked that fellows should be eager to talk with her and escort her within his observation. There was even a kind of lofty coquetry on her part that he would not have objected to. But what he did not like were her ways in relation to Deronda. After the musical party at Lady Mallinger's, when Grandcourt had observed the dialogue on the settee as keenly as Hans had done, It was characteristic of him that he named Deronda for invitation along with the Mallingers, tenaciously avoiding the possible suggestion to anybody concerned that Deronda's presence or absence could be of the least importance to him. And he made no direct observation to Gwendolen on her behavior that evening, lest the expression of his disgust should be a little too strong to satisfy his own pride. But a few days afterward he remarked, without being careful of the apropos, "Nothing makes a woman more of a gawky than looking out after people and showing tempers in public. A woman ought to have good manners, else it's intolerable to appear with her." Gwendolen made the expected application, and was not without alarm at the notion of being a gawky, for she too, with her melancholy distaste for things, preferred that her distaste should include admirers. But the sense of overhanging rebuke only intensified the strain of expectation toward any meeting with Deronda. The novelty and excitement of her town life was like the hurry and constant change of foreign travel. Whatever might be the inward despondency, there was a program to be filled, not without gratification to many-sided self. But as always happens with a deep interest, the comparatively rare occasions on which she could exchange any words with Deronda had a diffuse effect in her consciousness, magnifying their communication with each other, and therefore enlarging the place she imagined it to have in his mind. How could Deronda help this? He certainly did not avoid her. Rather he wished to convince her by every delicate indirect means that her confidence in him had not been indiscreet since it had not lowered his respect. Moreover, he liked being near her. How could it be otherwise? She was something more than a problem. She was a lovely woman, for the turn of whose mind and fate he had a care, which, however futile it might be, kept soliciting him as a responsibility, perhaps all the more that when he dared to think of his own future, he saw it lying far away from this splendid, sad-hearted creature, who, because he had once been impelled to arrest her attention momentarily, as he might have seized her arm with warning to hinder her from stepping where there was danger, had turned to him with a beseeching, persistent need. One instance in which Grandcourt stimulated a feeling in Gwendolen that he would have liked to suppress without seeming to care about it, had relation to Mirah. Gwendolen's inclination lingered over the project of the singing lessons, as a sort of obedience to Deronda's advice. But day followed day with that want of perceived leisure which belongs to lives where there is no work to mark off intervals, and the continual liability to Grandcourt's presence and surveillance seemed to flatten every effort to the level of the boredom which his manner expressed. His negative mind was as diffusive as fog, clinging to all objects and spoiling all contact. But one morning when they were breakfasting, Gwendolen, in a recurrent fit of determination to exercise the old spirit, said, dallying prettily over her prawns without eating them, "I think of making myself accomplished while we are in town, and having singing lessons." "Why?" said Grandcourt languidly. "Why?" echoed Gwendolen, playing at sauciness. "Because I can't eat pâté de foie gras to make me sleepy, and I can't smoke, and I can't go to the club to make me like to come away again. I want a variety of ennui. What would be the most convenient time, when you are busy with your lawyers and people, for me to have lessons from that little Jewess whose singing is getting all the rage?" "Whenever you like," said Grandcourt, pushing away his plate and leaning back in his chair while he looked at her with his most lizard-like expression, and played with the ears of the tiny spaniel on his lap. Gwendolen had taken a dislike to the dogs because they fawned on him. Then he said languidly, "I don't see why a lady should sing. Amateurs make fools of themselves. A lady can't risk herself in that way in company. And one doesn't want to hear squalling in private." "I like frankness. That seems to me a husband's great charm," said Gwendolen, with her little upward movement of her chin, as she turned her eyes away from his, and lifting a prawn before her, looked at the boiled ingenuousness of its eyes as preferable to the lizard's. "But," she added, having devoured her mortification, I suppose you don't object to Miss Lapidoth singing at our party on the 4th? I thought of engaging her. Lady Brackenshaw had her, you know, and the Raymonds, who are very particular about their music. And Mr. Deronda, who is a musician himself and a first-rate judge, says there is no singing in such good taste as hers for a drawing-room. I think his opinion is an authority." She meant to sling a small stone at her husband in that way. "It's very indecent of Deronda to go about praising that girl," said Grandcourt, in a tone of indifference. "Indecent!" exclaimed Gwendolen, reddening and looking at him again, overcome by startled wonder, and unable to reflect on the probable falsity of the phrase, "to go about praising." "Yes, and especially when she is patronized by Lady Mallinger. He ought to hold his tongue about her. Men can see what is his relation to her." "Men who judge others by themselves!" said Gwendolen, turning white after her redness, and immediately smitten with the dread of her own words. "Of course. And a woman should take their judgment, else she is likely to run her head into the wrong place," said Grandcourt, conscious of using pincers on that white creature. "I suppose you take Deronda for a saint." "Oh dear, no," said Gwendolen, summoning desperately her almost miraculous power of self‐control, and speaking in a high, hard tone. "Only a little less of a monster." She rose, pushed her chair away without hurry, and walked out of the room with something like the care of a man who is afraid of showing that he has taken more wine than usual. She turned the keys inside her dressing-room doors, and sat down for some time looking pale and quiet as when she was leaving the breakfast-room. Even in the moments after reading the poisonous letter she had hardly had more cruel sensations than now, for emotion was at the acute point where it is not distinguishable from sensation. Deronda, unlike what she had believed him to be, was an image which affected her as a hideous apparition would have done, quite apart from the way in which it was produced. It had taken hold of her as pain before she could consider whether it were fiction or truth. And further to hinder her power of resistance came the sudden perception how very slight were the grounds of her faith in Deronda, how little she knew of his life, how childish she had been in her confidence. His rebukes and his severity to her began to seem odious, along with all the poetry and lofty doctrine in the world, whatever it might be, and the grave beauty of his face seemed the most unpleasant mask that the common habits of men could put on. All this went on in her with the rapidity of a sick dream, and her start into resistance was very much like a waking. Suddenly from out the gray sombre morning there came a stream of sunshine, wrapping her in warmth and light where she sat in stony stillness. She moved gently and looked round her. There was a world outside this bad dream, and the dream proved nothing. She rose, stretching her arms upward and clasping her hands with her habitual attitude when she was seeking relief from oppressive feeling, and walked about the room in this flood of sunbeams. "It is not true. What does it matter whether he believes it or not?" This is what she repeated to herself, but this was not her faith come back again. It was only the desperate cry of faith, finding suffocation intolerable. And how could she go on through the day in this state? With one of her impetuous alternations, her imagination flew to wild actions by which she would convince herself of what she wished. She would go to Lady Mallinger and question her about Mirah. She would write to Deronda and upbraid him with making the world all false and wicked and hopeless to her. To him she dared pour out all the bitter indignation of her heart. No, she would go to Mirah. This last form taken by her need was more definitely practicable, and quickly became imperious. No matter what came of it, she had the pretext of asking Mirah to sing at her party on the 4th. What was she going to say beside? How satisfy? She did not foresee. She could not wait to foresee. If that idea which was maddening her had been a living thing, she would have wanted to throttle it without waiting to foresee what would come of the act. She rang her bell and asked if Mr. Grandcourt were gone out. Finding that he was, she ordered the carriage and began to dress for the drive. Then she went down and walked about the large drawing-room like an imprisoned dumb creature, not recognizing herself in the glass panels, not noting any object around her in the painted, gilded prison. Her husband would probably find out where she had been, and punish her in some way or other. No matter. She could neither desire nor fear anything just now, but the assurance that she had not been deluding herself in her trust. She was provided with Mirah's address. Soon she was on the way with all the fine equipage necessary to carry about her poor uneasy heart, depending in its palpitations on some answer or other to questioning which she did not know how she should put. She was as heedless of what happened before she found that Miss Lapidoth was at home as one is of lobbies and passages on the way to a court of justice, heedless of everything till she was in a room where there were folding doors, and she heard Deronda's voice behind it. Doubtless the identification was helped by forecast, but she was as certain of it as if she had seen him. She was frightened at her own agitation, and began to unbutton her gloves that she might button them again, and bite her lips over the pretended difficulty, while the door opened, and Mirah presented herself with perfect quietude and a sweet smile of recognition. There was relief in the sight of her face, and Gwendolen was able to smile in return, while she put out her hand in silence. And as she seated herself, all the while hearing the voice, she felt some reflux of energy in the confused sense that the truth could not be anything that she dreaded. Mirah drew her chair very near, as if she felt that the sound of the conversation should be subdued, and looked at her visitor with placid expectation, while Gwendolen began in a low tone, with something that seemed like bashfulness. "Perhaps you wonder to see me. Perhaps I ought to have written. But I wish to make a particular request." "I am glad to see you instead of having a letter," said Mirah, wondering at the changed expression and manner of the Vandyke duchess, as Hans had taught her to call Gwendolen. The rich color and calmness of her own face were in strong contrast with the pale, agitated beauty under the plumed hat. "I thought," Gwendolen went on, "at least I hoped, you would not object to sing at our house on the 4th, in the evening, at a party like Lady Brackenshaw's. I should be so much obliged." "I shall be very happy to sing for you. At 10?" said Mirah, while Gwendolen seemed to get more instead of less embarrassed. "At 10, please," she answered, then paused, and felt that she had nothing more to say. She could not go. It was impossible to rise and say good-bye. Deronda's voice was in her ears. She must say it. She could contrive no other sentence. "Mr. Deronda is in the next room." "Yes," said Mirah in her former tone. "He is reading Hebrew with my brother." "You have a brother," said Gwendolen, who had heard this from Lady Mallinger, but had not minded it then. "Yes, a dear brother who is ill consumptive, and Mr. Deronda is the best of friends to him, as he has been to me," said Mirah, with the impulse that will not let us pass the mention of a precious person indifferently. "Tell me," said Gwendolen, putting her hand on Mirah's and speaking hardly above a whisper, "tell me the truth. You are sure he is quite good? You know no evil of him? Any evil that people say of him is false?" Could the proud-spirited woman have behaved more like a child? But the strange words penetrated Mirah with nothing but a sense of solemnity and indignation. With a sudden light in her eyes and a tremor in her voice, she said, "Who are the people that say evil of him? I would not believe any evil of him if an angel came to tell it me. He found me when I was so miserable. I was going to drown myself. I looked so poor and forsaken, you would have thought I was a beggar by the wayside. And he treated me as if I had been a king's daughter. He took me to the best of women. He found my brother for me. And he honors my brother, though he too was poor. Oh, almost as poor as he could be. And my brother honors him. That is no light thing to say. Here Mirah's tone changed to one of profound emphasis, and she shook her head backward. "For my brother is very learned and great-minded, and Mr. Deronda says there are few men equal to him." Some Jewish defiance had flamed into her indignant gratitude, and her anger could not help including Gwendolen, since she seemed to have doubted Deronda's goodness. But Gwendolen was like one parched with thirst, drinking the fresh water that spreads through the frame as a sufficient bliss. She did not notice that Mirah was angry with her. She was not distinctly conscious of anything but of the penetrating sense that Deronda and his life were no more like her husband's conception than the morning in the horizon was like the morning mixed with street gas. Even Mirah's words sank into the indefiniteness of her relief. She could hardly have repeated them, or said how her whole state of feeling was changed. She pressed Mirah's hand and said, "Thank you, thank you," in a hurried whisper, then rose and added with only a hazy consciousness, "I must go. I shall see you on the 4th. I'm so much obliged," bowing herself out automatically, while Mirah, opening the door for her, wondered at what seemed a sudden retreat into chill loftiness. Gwendolen indeed had no feeling to spare in any effusiveness toward the creature who had brought her relief. The passionate need of contradiction to Grandcourt's estimate of Deronda, a need which had blunted her sensibility to everything else, was no sooner satisfied than she wanted to be gone. She began to be aware that she was out of place, and to dread Deronda's seeing her. And once in the carriage again, she had the vision of what awaited her at home. When she drew up before the door in Grosvenor Square, her husband was arriving with a cigar between his fingers. He threw it away and handed her out, accompanying her upstairs. She turned into the drawing-room lest he should follow her farther and give her no place to retreat to. Then she sat down with a weary air, taking off her gloves, rubbing her hand over her forehead, and making his presence as much of a cipher as possible. But he sat too, and not far from her, just in front, where to avoid looking at him must have the emphasis of effort. "May I ask where you have been at this extraordinary hour?" said Grandcourt. "Oh, yes, I've been to Miss Lapidoth's, to ask her to come and sing for us," said Gwendolen, laying her gloves on the little table beside her and looking down at them. "And to ask her about her relations with Deronda?" said Grandcourt, with the coldest possible sneer in his low voice, which in poor Gwendolen's ear was diabolical. For the first time since their marriage she flashed out upon him without inward check. Turning her eyes full on his, she said in a biting tone, "Yes, and what you said is false—a low, wicked falsehood." "She told you so, did she?" returned Grandcourt with a more thoroughly distilled sneer. Gwendolen was mute. The daring anger within her was turned into the rage of dumbness. What reasons for her belief could she give? All the reasons that seemed so strong and living within her, she saw them suffocated and shriveled up under her husband's breath. There was no proof to give, but her own impression, which would seem to him her own folly. She turned her head quickly away from him and looked angrily toward the end of the room. She would have risen, but he was in her way. Grandcourt saw his advantage. "It's of no consequence so far as her singing goes," he said in his superficial drawl. "You can have her to sing if you like." Then after a pause he added in his lowest imperious tone, "But you will please to observe that you are not to go near that house again. As my wife you must take my word about what is proper for you. When you undertook to be Mrs. Grandcourt, you undertook not to make a fool of yourself. You have been making a fool of yourself this morning, and if you were to go on as you have begun, you might soon get yourself talked of at the clubs in a way you would not like. What do you know about the world? You have married me, and must be guided by my opinion." Every slow sentence of that speech had a terrific mastery in it for Gwendolen's nature. If the low tones had come from a physician telling her that her symptoms were those of a fatal disease, and prognosticating its course, she could not have been more helpless against the argument that lay in it. But she was permitted to move now, and her husband never again made any reference to what had occurred this morning. He knew the force of his own words. If this white-handed man with a perpendicular profile had been sent to govern a difficult colony, he might have won reputation among his contemporaries. He had certainly ability, would have understood that it was safer to exterminate than to cajole superseded proprietors, and would not have flinched from making things safe in that way. Gwendolen did not, for all this, part with her recovered faith. Rather she kept it with a more anxious tenacity, as a Protestant of old kept his Bible hidden, or a Catholic his crucifix, according to the side favored by the civil arm. And it was characteristic of her that, apart from the impression gained concerning Deronda in that visit, her imagination was little occupied with Mirah or the eulogized brother. The one result established for her was, that Deronda had acted simply as a generous benefactor, and the phrase "reading Hebrew" had fleeted unimpressively across her sense of hearing, as a stray stork might have made its peculiar flight across her landscape, without rousing any surprised reflection on its natural history. But the issue of that visit, as it regarded her husband, took a strongly active part in the process which made an habitual conflict within her, and was the cause of some external change, perhaps not observed by any one except Deronda. As the weeks went on, bringing occasional transient interviews with her, he thought that he perceived in her an intensifying of her superficial hardness and resolute display, which made her abrupt betrayals of agitation the more marked and disturbing to him. In fact, she was undergoing a sort of discipline for the refractory which, as soon as possible, like conversion, bends half the self with a terrible strain, and exasperates the unwillingness of the other half. Grandcourt had an active divination rather than discernment of refractoriness in her, and what had happened about Mirah quickened his suspicion that there was an increase of it, dependent on the occasions when she happened to see Deronda. There was some confounded nonsense between them. He did not imagine it exactly as flirtation, and his imagination in other branches was rather restricted. But it was nonsense that evidently kept up a kind of simmering in her mind, an inward action which might become disagreeable outward. Husbands in the old time are known to have suffered from a threatening devoutness in their wives, presenting itself first indistinctly as oddity, and ending in that mild form of lunatic asylum, a nunnery. Grandcourt had a vague perception of threatening moods in Gwendolen, which the unity between them in his views of marriage required him peremptorily to check. Among the means he chose, one was peculiar, and was less ably calculated than the speeches we have just heard. He determined that she should know the main purport of the will he was making, but he could not communicate this himself, because it involved the fact of his relation to Mrs. Glasher and her children, and that there should be any overt recognition of this between Gwendolen and himself was supremely repugnant to him. Like all proud, closely wrapped natures, he shrank from explicitness and detail, even on trivialities, if they were personal. A valet must maintain a strict reserve with him on the subject of shoes and stockings, and clashing was intolerable to him. His habitual want was to put collision out of the question by the quiet massive pressure of his rule. But he wished Gwendolen to know that before he made her an offer, it was no secret to him that she was aware of his relations with Lydia, her previous knowledge being the apology for bringing the subject before her now. Some men in his place might have thought of writing what he wanted her to know in the form of a letter, but Grandcourt hated writing. Even writing a note was a bore to him, and he had long been accustomed to have all his writing done by Lush. We know that there are persons who will forego their own obvious interest rather than do anything so disagreeable as to write letters, and it is not probable that these imperfect utilitarians would rush into manuscript and syntax on a difficult subject in order to save another's feelings. To Grandcourt it did not even occur that he should, would or could write to Gwendolen the information in question. And the only medium of communication he could use was Lush, who to his mind was as much of an implement as pen and paper. But here too Grandcourt had his reserves, and would not have uttered a word likely to encourage Lush in an impudent sympathy with any supposed grievance in a marriage which had been discommended by him. Who that has a confidant escapes believing too little in his penetration, and too much in his discretion? Grandcourt had always allowed Lush to know his external affairs indiscriminately: irregularities, debts, want of ready money. He had only used discrimination about what he would allow his confidant to say to him, and he had been so accustomed to this human tool that the having him at call in London was a recovery of lost ease. It followed that Lush knew all the provisions of the will more exactly than they were known to the testator himself. Grandcourt did not doubt that Gwendolen, since she was a woman who could put two and two together, knew or suspected Lush to be the contriver of her interview with Lydia, and that this was the reason why her first request was for his banishment. But the bent of a woman's inferences on mixed subjects, which excites mixed passions, is not determined by her capacity for simple addition, and here Grandcourt lacked the only organ of thinking that could have saved him from mistake, namely, some experience of the mixed passions concerned. He had correctly divined one half of Gwendolen's dread. All that related to her personal pride and her perception that his will must conquer hers. But the remorseful half, even if he had known of her broken promise, was as much out of his imagination as the other side of the moon. What he believed her to feel about Lydia was solely a tongue-tied jealousy, and what he believed Lydia to have written with the jewels was the fact that she had once been used to wearing them, with other amenities such as he imputed to the intercourse with jealous women. He had the triumphant certainty that he could aggravate the jealousy and yet smite it with a more absolute dumbness. His object was to engage all his wife's egoism on the same side as his own, and in his employment of Lush he did not intend to insult her. She ought to understand that he was the only possible envoy. Grandcourt's view of things was considerably fenced in by his general sense that what suited him others must put up with. There is no escaping the fact that want of sympathy condemns us to corresponding stupidity. Mephistopheles thrown upon real life and obliged to manage his own plots would inevitably make blunders. One morning he went to Gwendolen in the boudoir beyond the back drawing-room, hat and gloves in hand, and said in his best-tempered, most persuasive drawl, standing before her and looking down on her as she sat with a book in her lap, Gwendolen, there's some business about property to be explained. I have told Lush to come and explain it to you. He knows all about these things. I am going out. He can come up now. He's the only person who can explain. I suppose you'll not mind." "You know that I do mind," said Gwendolen, angrily starting up. "I shall not see him." She showed the intention to dart away to the door. Grandcourt was before her, with his back toward it. He was prepared for her anger, and showed none in return, saying, with the same sort of remonstrant tone that he might have used about an objection to dining out, "It's no use making a fuss. There are plenty of brutes in the world that one has to talk to. People with any savoir vivre don't make a fuss about such things. Some business must be done. You can't expect agreeable people to do it. If I employ Lush, the proper thing for you is to take it as a matter of course, not to make a fuss about it, not to toss your head and bite your lips about people of that sort." The drawling and the pauses with which this speech was uttered gave time for crowding reflections in Gwendolen, quelling her resistance. What was there to be told her about property? This word had certain dominant associations for her, first with her mother, then with Mrs. Glasher and her children. What would be the use if she refused to see Lush? Could she ask Grandcourt to tell her himself? That might be intolerable, even if he consented, which it was certain he would not, if he had made up his mind to the contrary. The humiliation of standing an obvious prisoner, with her husband barring the door, was not to be borne any longer, and she turned away to lean against a cabinet, while Grandcourt again moved toward her. "I have arranged for Lush to come up now while I am out," he said, after a long organ stop, during which Gwendolen made no sign. "Shall I tell him he may come?" Yet another pause before she could say, "Yes." Her face turned obliquely and her eyes cast down. "I shall come back in time to ride, if you like to get ready," said Grandcourt. No answer. "She is in a desperate rage," thought he. But the rage was silent, and therefore not disagreeable to him. It followed that he turned her chin and kissed her, while she still kept her eyelids down, and she did not move them until he was on the other side of the door. What was she to do? Search where she would in her consciousness, she found no plea to justify a plaint. Any romantic illusion she had had in marrying this man had turned on her power of using him as she liked. He was using her as he liked. She sat awaiting the announcement of Lush as a sort of searing operation that she had to go through. The facts that galled her gathered a burning power when she thought of their lying in his mind. It was all a part of that new gambling in which the losing was not simply a minus, but a terrible plus that had never entered into her reckoning. Lush was neither quite pleased nor quite displeased with his task. Grandcourt had said to him by way of conclusion, "Don't make yourself more disagreeable than nature obliges you." That depends, thought Lush. But he said, "I will write a brief abstract for Mrs. Grandcourt to read." He did not suggest that he should make the whole communication in writing, which was a proof that the interview did not wholly displease him. Some provision was being made for himself in the will, and he had no reason to be in a bad humor, even if a bad humor had been common with him. He was perfectly convinced that he had penetrated all the secrets of the situation, but he had no diabolical delight in it. He had only the small movements of gratified self-loving resentment in discerning that this marriage had fulfilled his own foresight in not being as satisfactory as the supercilious young lady had expected it to be, and as Grandcourt wished to feign that it was. He had no persistent spite much stronger than what gives the seasoning of ordinary scandal to those who repeat it and exaggerate it by their conjectures. With no active compassion or goodwill, he had just as little active malevolence, being chiefly occupied in liking his particular pleasures, and not disliking anything but what hindered those pleasures, anything else ranking with the last murder and the last opera bouffe under the head of things to talk about. Nevertheless, he was not indifferent to the prospect of being treated uncivilly by a beautiful woman, or to the counterbalancing fact that his present commission put into his hands an official power of humiliating her. He did not mean to use it needlessly, but there are some persons so gifted in relation to us that their "how do you do" seems charged with offense. By the time that Mr. Lush was announced, Gwendolen had braced herself to a bitter resolve that he should not witness the slightest betrayal of her feeling, whatever he might have to tell. She invited him to sit down with stately quietude. After all, what was this man to her? He was not in the least like her husband. Her power of hating a coarse, familiar-mannered man with clumsy hands was now relaxed by the intensity with which she hated his contrast. He held a small paper folded in his hand while he spoke. "I need hardly say that I should not have presented myself if Mr. Grandcourt had not expressed a strong wish to that effect, as no doubt he has mentioned to you." From some voices that speech might have sounded entirely reverential and even timidly apologetic. Lush had no intention to the contrary, but to Gwendolen's ear his words had as much insolence in them as his prominent eyes, and the pronoun "you" was too familiar. He ought to have addressed the folding screen and spoken of her as Mrs. Grandcourt. She gave the smallest sign of a bow, and Lush went on, with a little awkwardness, getting entangled in what is elegantly called tautology. My having been in Mr. Grandcourt's confidence for 15 years or more, since he was a youth, in fact, of course gives me a particular position. He can speak to me of affairs that he could not mention to any one else, and in fact he could not have employed any one else in this affair. I have accepted the task out of friendship for him, which is my apology for accepting the task, if you would have preferred some one else." He paused, but she made no sign, and Lush, to give himself a countenance in an apology which met no acceptance, opened the folded paper and looked at it vaguely before he began to speak again. "This paper contains some information about Mr. Grandcourt's will, an abstract of a part he wished you to know, if you'll be good enough to cast your eyes over it. But there is something I had to say by way of introduction, which I hope you'll pardon me for, if it's not quite agreeable." Lush found that he was behaving better than he had expected, and had no idea how insulting he made himself with his "not quite agreeable." "Say what you have to say without apologizing, please," said Gwendolen, with the air she might have bestowed on a dog‐stealer come to claim a reward for finding the dog he had stolen. "I have only to remind you of something that occurred before your engagement to Mr. Grandcourt," said Lush, not without the rise of some willing insolence in exchange for her scorn. "You met a lady in Cardell Chase, if you remember, who spoke to you of her position with regard to Mr. Grandcourt. She had children with her, one a very fine boy." Gwendolen's lips were almost as pale as her cheeks. Her passion had no weapons. Words were no better than chips. This man's speech was like a sharp knife edge drawn across her skin, but even her indignation at the employment of Lush was getting merged in a crowd of other feelings, dim and alarming as a crowd of ghosts. "Mr. Grandcourt was aware that you were acquainted with this unfortunate affair beforehand, and he thinks it only right that his position and intentions should be made quite clear to you. It is an affair of property and prospects, and if there were any objection you had to make—if you would mention it to me—it is a subject which of course he would rather not speak about himself, if you would be good enough just to read this." With the last words Lush rose and presented the paper to her. When Gwendolen resolved that she would betray no feeling in the presence of this man, she had not prepared herself to hear that her husband knew the silent consciousness, the silently accepted terms on which she had married him. She dared not raise her hand to take the paper, lest it should visibly tremble. For a moment Lush stood holding it toward her, and she felt his gaze on her as ignominy, before she could say even with low‐toned haughtiness, "Lay it on the table and go into the next room, please." Lush obeyed, thinking as he took an easy-chair in the back drawing-room, "My lady winces considerably. She didn't know what would be the charge for that superfine article, Henleigh Grandcourt." But it seemed to him that a penniless girl had done better than she had any right to expect, and that she had been uncommonly knowing for her years and opportunities. Her words to Lydia meant nothing, and her running away had probably been part of her adroitness. It had turned out a master stroke. Meanwhile Gwendolen was rallying her nerves to the reading of the paper. She must read it. Her whole being, pride, longing for rebellion, dreams of freedom, remorseful conscience, dread of fresh visitation, all made one need to know what the paper contained. But at first it was not easy to take in the meaning of the words. When she had succeeded, she found that in the case of there being no son as issue of her marriage, Grandcourt had made the small Henleigh his heir. That was all she cared to extract from the paper with any distinctness. The other statement, as to what provision would be made for her in the same case, she hurried over, getting only a confused perception of thousands and Gadsmere. It was enough. She could dismiss the man in the next room with the defiant energy which had revived in her at the idea that this question of property and inheritance was meant as a finish to her humiliations and her thraldom. She thrust the paper between the leaves of her book, which she took in her hand, and walked with her stateliest air into the next room, where Lush immediately arose, awaiting her approach. When she was 4 yards from him, it was hardly an instant that she paused to say, in a high tone, while she swept him with her eyelashes, "Tell Mr. Grandcourt that his arrangements are just what I desired," passing on without haste, and leaving Lush time to mingle some admiration of her graceful back with that half-amused sense of her spirit and impertinence which he expressed by raising his eyebrows and just thrusting his tongue between his teeth. He really did not want her to be worse punished, and he was glad to think that it was time to go and lunch at the club, where he meant to have a lobster salad. What did Gwendolen look forward to? When her husband returned he found her equipped in her riding dress, ready to ride out with him. She was not again going to be hysterical, or taken to her bed and say she was ill. That was the implicit resolve adjusting her muscles before she could have framed it in words, as she walked out of the room, leaving Lush behind her. She was going to act in the spirit of her message, and not to give herself time to reflect. She rang the bell for her maid, and went with the usual care through her change of toilette. Doubtless her husband had meant to produce a great effect on her. By and by perhaps she would let him see an effect the very opposite of what he intended, but at present all that she could show was a defiant satisfaction in what had been presumed to be disagreeable. It came as an instinct rather than a thought that to show any sign which could be interpreted as jealousy, when she had just been insultingly reminded that the conditions were what she had accepted with her eyes open, would be the worst self-humiliation. She said to herself that she had not time to-day to be clear about her future actions. All she could be clear about was that she would match her husband in ignoring any ground for excitement. She not only rode, but went out with him to dine, contributing nothing to alter their mutual manner, which was never that of rapid interchange in discourse. And curiously enough she rejected a handkerchief on which her maid had by mistake put the wrong scent, a scent that Grandcourt had once objected to. Gwendolen would not have liked to be an object of disgust to this husband whom she hated. She liked all disgust to be on her side. But to defer thought in this way was something like trying to talk without singing in her own ears. The thought that is bound up with our passion is as penetrative as air. Everything is porous to it. Bows, smiles, conversation, repartee are mere honeycombs where such thoughts rush freely, not always with a taste of honey. And without shutting herself up in any solitude, Gwendolen seemed at the end of 9 or 10 hours to have gone through a labyrinth of reflection, in which already the same succession of prospects had been repeated, the same fallacious outlets rejected, the same shrinking from the necessities of every course. Already she was undergoing some hardening effect from feeling that she was under eyes which saw her past actions solely in the light of her lowest motives. She lived back in the scenes of her courtship with a new bitter consciousness of what had been in Grandcourt's mind, certain now, with her present experience of him, that he had a peculiar triumph in conquering her dumb repugnance, and that ever since their marriage he had had a cold exultation in knowing her fancied secret. Her imagination exaggerated every tyrannical impulse he was capable of. "I will insist on being separated from him," was her first darting determination. Then, "I will leave him whether he consents or not. If this boy becomes his heir, I have made an atonement." But neither in darkness nor in daylight could she imagine the scenes which must carry out those determinations with the courage to feel them endurable. How could she run away to her own family, carry distress among them, and render herself an object of scandal in the society she had left behind her? What future lay before her as Mrs. Grandcourt gone back to her mother, who would be made destitute again by the rupture of the marriage for which one chief excuse had been that it had brought that mother a maintenance? She had lately been seeing her uncle and Anna in London, and though she had been saved from any difficulty about inviting them to stay in Grosvenor Square by their wish to be with Rex, who would not risk a meeting with her, The transient visit she had had from them helped now in giving stronger color to the picture of what it would be for her to take refuge in her own family. What could she say to justify her flight? Her uncle would tell her to go back. Her mother would cry. Her aunt and Anna would look at her with wondering alarm. Her husband would have power to compel her. She had absolutely nothing that she could allege against him in judicious or judicial ears. And to insist on separation—that was an easy combination of words, but considered as an action to be executed against Grandcourt, it would be about as practicable as to give him a pliant disposition and a dread of other people's unwillingness. How was she to begin? What was she to say that would not be a condemnation of herself? "If I am to have misery anyhow," was the bitter refrain of her rebellious dreams, "I had better have the misery that I can keep to myself." Moreover, her capability of rectitude told her again and again that she had no right to complain of her contract, or to withdraw from it. And always among the images that drove her back to submission was Deronda. The idea of herself separated from her husband gave Deronda a changed, perturbing, painful place in her consciousness. Instinctively she felt that the separation would be from him too, and in the prospective vision of herself as a solitary, dubiously regarded woman, she felt some tingling bashfulness at the remembrance of her behavior towards him. The association of Deronda with a dubious position for herself was intolerable. And what would he say if he knew everything? Probably that she ought to bear what she had brought on herself, unless she were sure that she could make herself a better woman by taking any other course. And what sort of woman was she to be? Solitary, sickened of life, looked at with a suspicious kind of pity? Even if she could dream of success in getting that dreary freedom, Mrs. Grandcourt, run away, would be a more pitiable creature than Gwendolen Harleth, condemned to teach the bishop's daughters, and to be inspected by Mrs. Mompert. One characteristic trait in her conduct is worth mentioning. She would not look a second time at the paper Lush had given her, and before ringing for her maid she locked it up in a traveling desk which was at hand, proudly resolved against curiosity about what was allotted to herself in connection with Gadsmere, feeling herself branded in the minds of her husband and his confidant with the meanness that would accept marriage and wealth on any conditions, however dishonorable and humiliating. Day after day the same pattern of thinking was repeated. There came nothing to change the situation, no new elements in the sketch, only a recurrence which engraved it. The May weeks went on into June, and still Mrs. Grandcourt was outwardly in the same place, presenting herself as she was expected to do in the accustomed scenes, with the accustomed grace, beauty, and costume. From church at one end of the week, through all the scale of desirable receptions, to opera at the other. Church was not markedly distinguished in her mind from other forms of self-presentation, for marriage had included no instruction that enabled her to connect liturgy and sermon with any larger order of the world than that of unexplained and perhaps inexplicable social fashions. While a laudable zeal was laboring to carry the light of spiritual law up the alleys where law is chiefly known as the policeman, the brilliant Mrs. Grandcourt, condescending a little to a fashionable rector, and conscious of a feminine advantage over a learned dean, was, so far as pastoral care and religious fellowship were concerned, in as complete solitude as a man in a lighthouse. Can we wonder at the practical submission which hid her constructive rebellion? The combination is common enough, as we know from the number of persons who make us aware of it in their own case, by a clamorous, unwearied statement of the reasons against their submitting to a situation which, on inquiry, we discover to be the least disagreeable within their reach. Poor Gwendolen had both too much and too little mental power and dignity to make herself exceptional. No wonder that Deronda now marked some hardening in a look and manner which were schooled daily to the suppression of feeling. For example, one morning, riding in Rotten Row with Grandcourt by her side, She saw standing against the railing at the turn, just facing them, a dark‐eyed lady with a little girl and a blonde boy, whom she at once recognized as the beings in all the world the most painful for her to behold. She and Grandcourt had just slackened their pace to a walk. He being on the outer side was the nearer to the unwelcome vision, and Gwendolen had not presence of mind to do anything but glance away from the dark eyes that met hers piercingly toward Grandcourt, who wheeled past the group with an unmoved face, giving no sign of recognition. Immediately she felt a rising rage against him mingling with her shame for herself, and the words, "You might at least have raised your hat to her," flew impetuously to her lips, but did not pass them. If as her husband, in her company, he chose to ignore these creatures whom she herself had excluded from the place she was filling, how could she be the person to reproach him? She was dumb. It was not chance, but her own design, that had brought Mrs. Glasher there with her boy. She had come to town under the pretext of making purchases, really wanting educational apparatus for her children, and had had interviews with Lush in which she had not refused to soothe her uneasy mind by representing the probabilities as all on the side of her ultimate triumph. Let her keep quiet, and she might live to see the marriage itself dissolve in one way or another. Lush hinted at several ways, leaving the succession assured to her boy. She had had an interview with Grandcourt too, who had as usual told her to behave like a reasonable woman, and threatened punishment if she were troublesome, but had also as usual vindicated himself from any wish to be stingy, the money he was receiving from Sir Hugo on account of Diplow encouraging him to be lavish. Lydia, feeding on the probabilities in her favor, devoured her helpless wrath along with that pleasanter nourishment, but she could not let her discretion go entirely without the reward of making a Medusa apparition before Gwendolen, vindictiveness and jealousy finding relief in an outlet of venom, though it were as futile as that of a viper already flung on the other side of the hedge. Hence, each day, after finding out from Lush the likely time for Gwendolen to be riding, she had watched at that post, daring Grandcourt so far. Why should she not take little Henleigh into the park? The Medusa apparition was made effective beyond Lydia's conception by the shock it gave Gwendolen actually to see Grandcourt ignoring this woman who had once been the nearest in the world to him, along with the children she had borne him. And all the while the dark shadow thus cast on the lot of a woman destitute of acknowledged social dignity spread itself over her visions of a future that might be her own, and made part of her dread on her own behalf. She shrank all the more from any lonely action. What possible release could there be for her from this hated vantage ground, which she yet dared not quit, any more than if fire had been raining outside it? What release but death? Not her own death. Gwendolen was not a woman who could easily think of her own death as a near reality, or front for herself the dark entrance on the untried and invisible. It seemed more possible that Grandcourt should die, and yet not likely. The power of tyranny in him seemed a power of living in the presence of any wish that he should die. The thought that his death was the only possible deliverance for her was one with the thought that deliverance would never come. The double deliverance from the injury with which other beings might reproach her, and from the yoke she had brought on her own neck. No! She foresaw him always living, and her own life dominated by him, the always of her young experience not stretching beyond the few immediate years that seemed immeasurably long with her passionate weariness. The thought of his dying would not subsist. It turned as with a dream change into the terror that she should die with his throttling fingers on her neck, avenging that thought. Fantasies moved within her like ghosts, making no break in her more acknowledged consciousness and finding no obstruction in it. Dark rays doing their work invisibly in the broad light. Only an evening or two after that encounter in the park there was a grand concert at Klesmer's, who was living rather magnificently now in one of the large houses in Grosvenor Place, a patron and prince among musical professors. Gwendolen had looked forward to this occasion as one on which she was sure to meet Deronda, and she had been meditating how to put a question to him, which, without containing a word that she would feel a dislike to utter, would yet be explicit enough for him to understand it. The struggle of opposite feelings would not let her abide by her instinct that the very idea of Deronda's relation to her was a discouragement to any desperate steps toward freedom. The next wave of emotion was a longing for some word of his to enforce a resolve. The fact that her opportunities of conversation with him had always to be snatched in the doubtful privacy of large parties, caused her to live through them many times beforehand, imagining how they would take place and what she would say. The irritation was proportionate when no opportunity came. And this evening at Klesmer's she included Deronda in her anger, because he looked as calm as possible at a distance from her, while she was in danger of betraying her impatience to every one who spoke to her. She found her only safety in a chill haughtiness which made Mr. Vandernoodt remark that Mrs. Grandcourt was becoming a perfect match for her husband. When at last the chances of the evening brought Deronda near her, Sir Hugo and Mrs. Raymond were close by and could hear every word she said. No matter, her husband was not near, and her irritation passed without check into a fit of daring which restored the security of her self-possession. Deronda was there at last, and she would compel him to do what she pleased. Already and without effort rather queenly in her air as she stood in her white lace and green leaves, she threw a royal permissiveness into her way of saying, "I wish you would come and see me to-morrow between 5 and 6, Mr. Deronda." There could be but one answer at that moment: certainly, with a tone of obedience. Afterward it occurred to Deronda that he would write a note to excuse himself. He had always avoided making a call at Grandcourt's. He could not persuade himself to any step that might hurt her, and whether his excuse were taken for indifference or the affectation of indifference, it would be equally wounding. He kept his promise. Gwendolen had declined to ride out on the plea of not feeling well enough, having left her refusal to the last moment when the horses were soon to be at the door, not without alarm lest her husband should say that he too would stay at home. Become almost superstitious about his power of suspicious divination, she had a glancing forethought of what she would do in that case, namely, have herself denied as not well. But Grandcourt accepted her excuse without remark, and rode off. Nevertheless, when Gwendolen found herself alone, and had sent down the order that only Mr. Deronda was to be admitted, she began to be alarmed at what she had done, and to feel a growing agitation in the thought that he would soon appear, and she should soon be obliged to speak, not of trivialities, as if she had no serious motive in asking him to come, and yet what she had been for hours determining to say began to seem impossible. For the first time the impulse of appeal to him was being checked by timidity, and now that it was too late, she was shaken by the possibility that he might think her invitation unbecoming. If so, she would have sunk in his esteem. But immediately she resisted this intolerable fear as an infection from her husband's way of thinking. That he would say she was making a fool of herself was rather a reason why such a judgment would be remote from Deronda's mind. But that she could not rid herself from this sudden invasion of womanly reticence was manifest in a kind of action which had never occurred to her before. In her struggle between agitation and the effort to suppress it, she was walking up and down the length of the two drawing-rooms, where at one end a long mirror reflected her in her black dress, chosen in the early morning with a half-admitted reference to this hour. But above this black dress her head on its white pillar of a neck showed to advantage. Some consciousness of this made her turn hastily and hurry to the boudoir, where again there was a glass, but also tossed over a chair a large piece of black lace, which she snatched and tied over her crown of hair, so as completely to conceal her neck and leave only her face looking out from the black frame. In this manifest contempt of appearance she thought it possible to be freer from nervousness, but the black lace did not take away the uneasiness from her eyes and lips. She was standing in the middle of the room when Deronda was announced, and as he approached her she perceived that he too for some reason was not his usual self. She could not have defined the change except by saying that he looked less happy than usual, and appeared to be under some effort in speaking to her, and yet the speaking was the slightest possible. They both said, "How do you do?" quite curtly, and Gwendolen, instead of sitting down, moved to a little distance, resting her arms slightly on the tall back of a chair, while Deronda stood where he was, both feeling it difficult to say any more, though the preoccupation in his mind could hardly have been more remote than it was from Gwendolen's conception. She naturally saw in his embarrassment some reflection of her own. Forced to speak, she found all her training in concealment and self-command of no use to her, and began with timid awkwardness. "You will wonder why I begged you to come. I wanted to ask you something. You said I was ignorant. That is true. And what can I do but ask you?" And at this moment she was feeling it utterly impossible to put the question she had intended. Something new in her nervous manner roused Deronda's anxiety lest there might be a new crisis. He said with the sadness of affection in his voice, "My only regret is that I can be of so little use to you." The words and the tone touched a new spring in her, and she went on with more sense of freedom, yet still not saying anything she had designed to say, and beginning to hurry that she might somehow arrive at the right words. "I wanted to tell you that I have always been thinking of your advice, but is it any use? I can't make myself different, because things about me raise bad feelings, and I must go on. I can alter nothing. It is no use." She paused an instant, with the consciousness that she was not finding the right words, but began again hurriedly. "But if I go on I shall get worse. I want not to get worse. I should like to be what you wish. There are people who are good and enjoy great things. I know there are. I am a contemptible creature. I feel as if I should get wicked with hating people. I have tried to think that I would go away from everybody, but I can't. There are so many things to hinder me. You think perhaps that I don't mind, but I do mind. I am afraid of everything. I am afraid of getting wicked. Tell me what I can do." She had forgotten everything but that image of her helpless misery which she was trying to make present to Deronda in broken allusive speech, wishing to convey but not express all her need. Her eyes were tearless, and had a look of smarting in their dilated brilliancy. There was a subdued sob in her voice which was more and more veiled, till it was hardly above a whisper. She was hurting herself with the jewels that glittered on her tightly clasped fingers pressed against her heart. The feeling Deronda endured in these moments he afterward called horrible. Words seemed to have no more rescue in them than if he had been beholding a vessel in peril of wreck, the poor ship with its many-lived anguish beaten by the inescapable storm. How could he grasp the long-growing process of this young creature's wretchedness, how arrest and change it with a sentence? He was afraid of his own voice. The words that rushed into his mind seemed in their feebleness nothing better than despair made audible, or than that insensibility to another's hardship which applies precept to soothe pain. He felt himself holding a crowd of words imprisoned within his lips, as if the letting them escape would be a violation of awe before the mysteries of our human lot. The thought that urged itself foremost was, "Confess everything to your husband. Have nothing concealed." The words carried in his mind a vision of reasons which would have needed much fuller expressions for Gwendolen to apprehend them. But before he had begun those brief sentences, the door opened, and the husband entered. Grandcourt had deliberately gone out and turned back to satisfy a suspicion. What he saw was Gwendolen's face of anguish framed black like a nun's, and Deronda standing 3 yards from her with a look of sorrow such as he might have bent on the last struggle of life in a beloved object. Without any show of surprise, Grandcourt nodded to Deronda, gave a second look at Gwendolen, passed on, and seated himself easily at a little distance, crossing his legs, taking out his handkerchief and trifling with it elegantly. Gwendolen had shrunk and changed her attitude on seeing him, but she did not turn or move from her place. It was not a moment in which she could feign anything, or manifest any strong revulsion of feeling. The passionate movement of her last speech was still too strong within her. What she felt beside was a dull despairing sense that her interview with Deronda was at an end. A curtain had fallen. But he naturally was urged into self-possession and effort by susceptibility to what might follow for her from being seen by her husband in this betrayal of agitation; and feeling that any pretense of ease in prolonging his visit would only exaggerate Grandcourt's possible conjectures of duplicity, he merely said, "I will not stay longer now. Good-bye." He put out his hand, and she let him press her poor little chill fingers, but she said no good-bye. When he had left the room, Gwendolen threw herself into a seat with an expectation as dull as her despair—the expectation that she was going to be punished. But Grandcourt took no notice. He was satisfied to have let her know that she had not deceived him, and to keep a silence which was formidable with omniscience. He went out that evening, and her plea of feeling ill was accepted without even a sneer. The next morning at breakfast he said, "I am going yachting to the Mediterranean." "When?" said Gwendolen, with a leap of heart which had hope in it. "The day after to-morrow. The yacht is at Marseilles. Lush is gone to get everything ready." "Shall I have mamma to stay with me, then?" said Gwendolen, the new sudden possibility of peace and affection filling her mind like a burst of morning light. "No. You will go with me." End of Chapter 48. This recording is in the public domain.